Blake Lovell and Chris Lee of Southeastern 14 here to preview Texas A&M's football schedule for the 2023 season. We're doing this in June. Blake, we try to do these in tiers in terms of runs of games, 3 or 4 in a row. A&M's is not as obvious in that regard as some other teams are. Let me start here, though. Okay, 2 of the first 3 games are built-in wins. We run a power poll where we average 3 magazines we like and a couple of computers that release and take a composite 1 to 133. And the Aggies play, 2 of the worst 4 teams in the FBS to start the season in terms of New Mexico and Louisiana Monroe. We're not going to spend any time there. In between, though, a game at Miami, which, if I remember correctly, and here I found it, 17-9 a year ago, low scoring, like many of the Aggies games were. Miami and A&M are 2 of the programs nationally that are at the top of the list of uncertainty of where this is going to go. I think both programs had reasons to think they were headed back towards the top of college football's elite teams. And then came 2022, which is sort of a not so fast moment for both those teams. So that Miami game was an interesting one a year ago. It's on the road this year again. I'm going to find that very fascinating and perhaps a barometer where both teams' seasons are heading.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because that was kind of it was an interesting dynamic last year, the way that game set up after the Appalachian State loss, and we were talking about just the importance of that game for Texas A&M, and wound up winning it. We know the rest of the season didn't exactly go according to plan, but it's just on the road, and I think these road games, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's an afternoon kickoff, ABC, Hard Rock Stadium. Yeah, I mean, it's trying to figure out, I think, exactly what you're going to get from Miami coming off of a 5-7 season. Obviously, expected. These are 2 teams that have something to prove, right? And I think that's the best way to angle this game. These are 2 teams in game 2 of the season. We probably won't learn a lot in game 1 of the season for either. But game 2, this is where you start to prove what you can be in the upcoming season. And I think, again, what is on the line for both teams in that game? There's a lot on the line for a second game of the season. Yeah, I'm very interested to see, what things look like for this Texas A&M team, how they perform in that game, because then, as we're going to talk about, it's not the worst setup in the world in terms of how they're going to, I don't want to say ease into their SEC schedule, but the way it falls in terms of getting games in the state of Texas after that, several, it's a big game for A&M. If they can win that one, things get very interesting for the Aggies. So.
Well, let's get to the next 2. I think these are 2 big swing games which might establish some momentum either positively or negatively for the Aggies. And boy, when you get negative momentum going in the SEC, that is when a season collapses. You can ask Tennessee, you can ask Florida, you can ask Texas A&M, you can ask. The point is, I'm trying not to pick on the Aggies here. They're not the only team in that boat, but it's a fact of life. And I think that game against Auburn, which, if you're A&M, there's 2 things you like about it. A, it's at home, and B, you're getting Auburn early before everybody's had a full season to grasp Hugh Freeze's new schemes and whatever comes with that. So, and then you get the Arkansas game in Arlington as usual. So A&M will go its first 5 games will only hit the road once, and I think at this point, goodness, you need to be at least 3-2, if not 4-1, to feel really good about the direction of where things are heading.
Yeah, I think again you got to take advantage of games that are at home, or the one in Arlington. It's not a true road environment. We know there'll be some Hawk fans there. Just to ask, a good portion of our audience, they'll be there for that one. But still, just to take advantage of those big games, like that is what we talk about. It's what is going to put you in position to challenge an Alabama or an LSU at the top of the SEC West. You have to beat those kind of teams, and that's the only way to leapfrog them and to get Alabama at home. And we'll talk about the LSU game later, but like you said, to get an Auburn early in the Hugh Freeze era, probably better than getting them later down the line. Although, again, they could be further along than we think. Arkansas, always an entertaining game. I think they're just with those 2 teams playing at AT&T Stadium, and then to get that heavyweight showdown against Alabama on October 7th. I mean, we've talked about Alabama. I mean, this is an Alabama team that I think, as always, is going to try to compete for a national championship. But it's not as though maybe this is a team that is just intimidating for some people, perhaps just because we don't know the quarterback situation as of right now. Not to say that it can't turn into a great situation for Alabama, but there are some guys they have to replace. There are some sort of program changing type guys that they have to replace, and obviously not changing a program too much for Alabama because they're usually going to win a lot of games, but these were, these are players we're going to remember at Alabama, in terms of Bryce Young and Will Anderson and those kind of guys. And so, yeah, it becomes a big opportunity there at Kyle Field for Texas A&M. And yeah, those 3 games, those are the ones you definitely circle because that could send you in the right direction. But as you said, it could also send you in the wrong direction if you were to lose, 2 or more of those games. So
Yeah, and we are not doing anything in these schedule preview videos for the most part to talk about expectations and what we think of teams. We're just looking at who they play. I will give you a spoiler alert. I think I got plenty of reason to believe that AM can be a lot better this year. And we'll get into that when we preview the Aggies in our team previews. But I think these 2 games, October the 7th and the 14th, Alabama and at Tennessee, are going to be games where, like, if A&M is going to be where A&M thought it was going to be 12 months ago, boy, even if I don't see under any circumstances how you're unhappy if you win 1 out of 2. And I think that would be a really good outcome, especially with the Tennessee game being on the road. A&M has notoriously played Alabama tough, even when it's not been as good. So I think that one is one to circle for a number of reasons. But I think if the Aggies can win one of those 2, Blake, they've got to feel pretty decent about where things are headed. And I think there's a case where they've got a shot in each of those games.
look, if you're 6-1 going into your bye week on October 21st, I mean, there's no,
Yeah.
I mean, that I think that's probably best case scenario because I think that's assuming you're probably going to lose one of Alabama and Tennessee. Not to say you can't win both, but and that's where we talked about the importance of the Miami game and a game against Arkansas and Arlington. Like that's what you want to see, I think, if you're an A&M fan as you're looking at this, because that still puts you in the SEC West title conversation as you enter late October. And that's where Texas A&M wants to be. They don't want to have 2 or 3 losses at this point, knowing that you're not going to catch most likely Alabama or LSU at that rate. It's just not going to happen. So I think that's the way you look at it. And so if A&M could be 6-1 somehow heading into this, then you will all of a sudden have the full confidence that this team is doing what most want to see them do if you're a Texas A&M fan, in terms of just completely changing the foundation of where things were last year and trying to turn this into a special season. And that's where I think it becomes intriguing just with the Bobby Petrino aspect of the offense and what that looks like. That Tennessee game could be very entertaining based on what these 2 offenses could be. So before A&M heads into that bye week.
Yeah, the bye week precedes this sequence: South Carolina at home, at Ole Miss, Mississippi State at home. I think those are 3 fascinating games in terms of the timing. And here's what I mean. South Carolina, I've seen Carolina play in September and October, and on the worst day, or on sometimes on their best days, you feel like that's an ordinary football team. Sometimes you feel like they're not a good football team at all. And then the calendar flips to November and they're beating anybody and everybody. You can ask Tennessee and Clemson about that. So it'll be very interesting to see if that's a thing under Shane Beamer, if it's just a small sample size fluke, where Carolina is at that point. I think that's a good ball team. But again, depending on when you played Carolina in the past, it has looked very different. Ole Miss team last year started 7-0. Now, a lot of that was due to a weak schedule at that point. And then when the big boys hit, it went sour in a hurry. Now, the other factor in there, too, was Lane Kiffin's what seemed like month-long flirtation with Auburn that I think he got distracted. The team got distracted. That had something to do with the collapse. So I'm very interested to see how Kiffin, on a roster that he has built with transfers, which sometimes is not the best recipe for chemistry, how that sits at that point of the season, because that could look very different depending on when you play Ole Miss. Mississippi State, another one. I would probably rather play State earlier than late. State, a lot of people think is going to be pretty decent on defense. Will Rogers is the most experienced quarterback in the league, I think, at this point, probably. But they are changing offense. You're actually going to see tight ends on the team this year. They're going to try to run the ball more. They're not coached by Mike Leach anymore. And not to knock Zach Arnett, but Mike Leach was one of the 10 best offensive minds in the game. It's going to look very different. And by that point, State is going to be more used to whatever it is Zach Arnett wants to do differently. And it could be going really well. It could be going really poorly. But I think those three games are not only interesting for who they play, but also just for the timing of those for those reasons, Blake.
Yep. I mean, we always say it's kind of when you go into the SEC season, you're going to pick like 2 or 3, 4 teams maybe that you're just like, all right, those could be the wild card teams of the group. And it's really a matter of, it could go either way in terms of what their season could look like. Mississippi State, I think, is probably one of the bigger, maybe the biggest unknown, just in terms of, like you said, they're changing their entire landscape perhaps on offense and still going to have a good defense that'll kind of drive them. But South Carolina, we expect them to build off the momentum that they built late last season, getting sort of for Shane Beamer, probably, defining wins over, the two teams that they beat there at the end with Tennessee and Clemson. And so, yeah, I mean, it is one of those where just to see where they're at. And then Ole Miss, another wild card. I think you have a team that's built on transfers, as you mentioned, and sometimes those work out, sometimes they don't, and it's trying to find the chemistry to put it all together. Maybe Ole Miss winds up being the sleeper in the SEC West we're not talking enough about. So a lot of potential things in play with that 3-game stretch, and that, of course, makes it very interesting to see where A&M's at and what kind of meaning a game on November 25th at LSU could mean for the Aggies, depending on what they've done to that point.
Yeah, we get to the late season FCS game. That usually the 11th game in the sequence for a lot of teams. That is the case for the Aggies, who will host in-state team Abilene Christian. And then we get to LSU. Abilene Christian last year, by the way, went 7-4. And then we get to LSU in what has been a very interesting game. You had the game a few years ago that I think changed the overtime rules because they played about 3 days. It was an extended weekend if you went to that game. But anyway, that one will be interesting. LSU, if all goes according to plan, will be competing for a national title at that point, at least through the perspective of Tiger fans. That one in Tiger Stadium will be fascinating if A&M can be the team that I think it can be.
Yeah, I mean, we remember what happened last season, as we talked about. I mean, it's just one of those things where, like I said, we will do our full A&M kind of breakdown of the team and everything, but it is fun to play the what if game and wonder how important this game could be for both teams, and really just kind of sense, okay, could this be a game for all the marbles? Like, could this be the game that sends the winner to the SEC, championship? It's certainly possible, but I think a lot of that's going to come down to what A&M does against Alabama, what they do, in those other games that we said could somewhat feel like they could go either way, and you sort of have the unknowns of what those other programs are going to be, just like with A&M is trying to figure out, can they have a big bounce back season? And if you try to find the confidence that they can do that, then it's fun to look at the what ifs and wonder how important that game will be, like I said, on November 25th in Baton Rouge. But overall, Chris, I look at the road slate here. That's what stands out the most to me. At Miami, at Tennessee, at Ole Miss, at LSU. Those are all big, big games that if you're going to turn the corner as a program, you feel like you've got to get a couple of those somewhere, because if not, right, I mean, that's 3 or 4 losses. And sure, I think we'll talk about expectations from A&M fans and all that. And, um, you know, maybe you don't think necessarily you're going to go 12-1 or something like that, but it's kind of a situation where I think you just want to find that step forward 5-7 season, and really to be able to do that, like I said, you're going to have to win some of those tough road games, but you're also going to have to take care of your business at home against the teams that could still push you, even though those games are in College Station. So,
Yeah, only 4 true road games. Of course, 1 neutral game. That's always a thing you look at that could help a little bit. You got some teams that aren't positioned accordingly in terms of the home and road split in the league too. So just that's worth a mention on the way out. All right, we will have you covered for every SEC team and their schedules. We'll start rolling out team previews pretty soon. We're in the middle of baseball content. We're doing this as the College World Series is about to start. So best way to catch all your SEC news involving football, baseball, and men's basketball is hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button. That helps our analytics. And if you like it, tell a friend. He is Blake Lovell. I am Chris Lee. We are Southeastern 14. We'll see you again soon with more SEC content.